Hello, this is Frank Shines and Umar Qureshi again with Analytics AI/ML. Recall during our last session, we talked about the overall Dmaic approach to solving problems. The focus today is on what's known as Dotwimpi or waste, muda. How do you remove non-value added activities? In order to do that, we need to understand the overall context. First of all, we have talked about the scientific approach. The first phase in the scientific approach to solving a problem is the define phase. We talked about define, measure, analyze, improve, control, the Dmaic. Now we're going to go into the define phase. In the define phase, we talked about the project charter in one of our previous sessions. We also talked about process mapping. Let's look at one of the process mapping examples related to making coffee from our previous session. This is important because without a process, you don't know where to focus your Dotwimpi. So we talked about this particular process where we put a filter with the coffee into the brewer, we pour the water into the brewer, we brew the coffee, we wait until it's finished brewing. Once it's finished brewing, we pour the coffee, and then we serve the coffee. We also showed the process map itself below. The process map shows the flow visually of how that process looks. Umar, can you show the process map? Okay, there we go. So we can see there from start to end. I was on a slightly larger screen there, and we can see those steps in the process. Now what we want to do is look at how do we remove non-value added activity. We noticed during our walk around, what's known as a Gemba, we walked around and looked how people were doing this in different various areas, different restaurants, cafes, and we saw them generally following these steps, but some people did it better and faster and simpler than others. For example, in some cases, people walked a long distance to grab the filter. Another place, they had to go to get the coffee in a different shelf. They had to reach up high. Sometimes they even had to go down low and stoop below or use a ladder to reach up high. So there's a lot of excessive motion and transportation and things that we're going to talk about that created time and non-value added activity in the process. So let's look at an example of the types of things we might see when we look at coffee. Let's look at that particular expired products and some of the other items that we typically might find. No, not the Dotwimpi yet. Let's look at the pictures of the specific examples that we looked at with the coffee. The coffee, we saw certain things that recurred over and over again that will help us understand some of these images related to waste, right? So in this particular case, what we'll see here is, for example, if the coffee has been sitting around for a long time, the mistake that can happen is an error called expired coffee, right? We can also see a case where we end up, if we produce too much coffee, it sits around, it gets cold, it gets stale, no one buys it, and we just wasted all that material. We've seen an example perhaps where there's a long waiting line, and so you lose customers, and so that creates waste. Extra stock of inventory, it takes up too much space in your cafe, in your restaurant, makes it difficult for you to respond to specific needs of customers if they decide they don't want that particular stock or that particular brand of coffee. So you don't want to have a lot of excess inventory and things like that. We talked before about people moving around, walking to different locations to try to get information and get the coffee and get everything together. So that creates extra transportation, the movement of things, or excessive motion, the movement of people trying to reach and grab and stretch and pull and get things, which then means that they're processing excessively. They're doing extra work. They may even have to do rework if they drop something because they reached up and they spilled it. So now that potentially creates injury and safety problems for the employees as well as for our coffee drinkers. Okay, so those are the types of things you would typically see in a restaurant. Now let's look specifically at Dotwimpi, what it means, and we'll put a primary focus on the DOT today. Okay, so when we look at a high-level example, we can see here, if you can drill into these areas, you can see Dotwimpi. D stands for defects. We'll see here, a defect is an error or a mistake that we make unintentionally. The O in Dotwimpi stands for overproduction. That's when we're producing more than what the demand of the market wants. So if you're producing more than what the customer needs, then that means the stuff that they don't buy, you're gonna have to put somewhere else, which creates inventory, which is one of the other I's in Dotwimpi. So DOT, transportation. T stands for excessive transportation or movement of, say, that inventory that we just created more of because we overproduced something that the customer wasn't willing to buy. If you can make this larger, it'll be easier for people to see there. You have to drill in. And so then on W, waiting. Waiting, we talked about before. If the customer's waiting on a product or they're waiting in line, then you're going to lose customers because they don't want to wait in line very long. But any waiting of people, they're waiting because the machinery isn't ready, or they're waiting because there's some sort of delay in the process. That creates waste because we're not converting, right, throughput. We're not creating and adding value to the process at every moment of time, and that therefore drives up your costs. We talked about I in terms of inventory. Again, you got to drill down more on these so that it's easier to see. It's too small. M is for motion. Motion is where we have excessive movement of the person. Transportation is excessive movement of the thing, the product. It could be the coffee cup. It could be a particular manufacturing assembly component or part, right? And then P stands for processing excessively. That's when we do something more than what the customer would be wanting to pay for. We call it gold plating. So if a customer says, hey, I want a toothbrush or I want a cup of coffee, and you say, well, right now I'm going to put a gold plate on it, make it look really pretty for you. And they say, listen, I don't need a gold plate coffee mug. I just need a basic coffee mug that's got my coffee in it, right? I don't need it to be gold plated. So that concept of gold plating means you're creating or processing excessively. You're doing more than what the customer is willing to pay for, which means it's going to cost more, it's going to take more time, and the customer probably won't pay for it because it's too costly. So now you just wasted all of that time, all of that effort. And then the last I is injury. It stands for injury to the person. That could be injury in terms of a safety issue, but it also can be injury not only physically, but injury intellectually. So if we have someone that is highly skilled at something, and we have them doing something that's very simple and rudimentary and boring and rote type of work. On the other hand, if we have someone who is a beginner and we have them trying to manage or do things that are extremely complex, so we want to match the work with the skills and the intellect of the person for the specific position. For example, if we're playing soccer and we have a person who's great on defense, they're probably not going to be your best striker, your offensive person. And the same thing with a person who is great at scoring goals. They may not necessarily be your best defender. And the same thing can be done and seen in many organizations, not just on teams. So the first part of this, we talked about the dot, is where we wanted to drill in and look at a larger screen so we can just see the dot part of this. And the dot, defects, overproduction, and transportation. And if we drill into these, we can see examples, but it's too small still to see. So we got to get to a larger view. We drill into that, we can see the specific examples of what we mean by these particular areas. So this is much better now. So we can see a defect is an error, and it's defined in terms of what the customer defines an error as, right? The old phrase, the customer is always right, the customer is king. A transactional example would be mistakes and errors like customer complaints, billing errors, a mistake on a form, a customer return, right? Or late payment. If we look at manufacturing or production examples of defects, that could be a defective item, a non-conformance. You got to scroll over, Umer, you can't see it. Scroll over further, and it could be a wrong component, it could be missing material, it could be wrong incoming product or out of spec product. Again, so there we go. And then the next is overproduction. So we talked about defects. We looked at examples of defects, whether they're transactional services, defects, or manufacturing. Overproduction, like we said, is when we're producing more than what the customer is willing to buy at that point in time. So examples of that. One would be that we excessively create discounts, promotions to get customers to buy when they don't really need the products, right? It sounds like a great idea, makes your sales look good, but now all of a sudden your production can't keep up with that, right? All the rest of the parts of your company can't keep up with that demand, and your customer doesn't really need it at that point, And it's always a possibility that if they don't need it, they're going to later come back and say, hey, sorry, I don't need it yet. Can you hold it a little bit longer? Now you have to keep that excess inventory on hand, and you've already spent all that time and overtime trying to pay for all these extra people to do the work for that product. And it's likely to create mistakes, because when you have too many people trying to do overtime, they get fatigued, they make more errors, and that's just been proven over and over again. So you created multiple problems as a result of that. Okay, so that's what happens when you begin to force a demand that isn't really there. Examples of that in the digital world is clickbait, right? Where you're driving someone to your website or driving someone to read something or look at something that they really don't want to read, because you've told them it's going to be one thing, it's actually something different. Or you've used what's called black box search engine optimization techniques, which is a way of getting Google and other search engines to get someone to your website, and then they get there and they find that what is on your website isn't what they were looking for. So you've kind of cheated the customer, so to speak. You wasted their time, you wasted resources and effort, and that particular visitor to your website is not going to convert and become a sale. So now you create all this overproduction, because people are now entering this data into different systems and are following up and are making phone calls to these people who are not going to call, or they're creating email campaigns for people who will never purchase. And so now you not only end up with dissatisfied potential customers, but you end up with negative social media feedback out there about your website, about what your company is doing. Manufacturing examples of overproduction is you're producing large lot sizes, right? You say, hey, listen, we got the machine and everything all set up. Instead of running 1,000 of these, let's run 10,000. But we know that, on average, the customers only buy 1,000 or 2,000 a month. So now you're going to have 5 months of extra inventory sitting around. So that creates overproduction, leads to expired product, means you have to move that material around, a little bit chance that it's also going to get damaged, creates all sorts of problems. In fact, now that you've got that overproduction, that brings us to transportation. So now where does that extra product that's sitting around go? Someone has to transport it to a different location in the warehouse, or a different logistic carrier. Perhaps different parts of the manufacturing processes have to excessively move things around. And you don't have the room for it. So you're paying for higher costs of inventory, you're creating all this additional work for people and movement of these items. And so we can see an example of the knock-on effect of one particular waste on another. So transportation, right? It's that excessive movement of things that are required to produce the products or services that your customers want. So examples in transactional, moving paper around in an office, moving files around to different folders on a computer, the extra clicks and scrolls and things that might take place in swipes. That's movement of the equipment, but then the eyes and things is a motion. So transportation and motion often go hand in hand. So now they're scrolling and moving up and down to try to find information in a mobile app or on a computer screen. And as we talked about before, from a transportation, manufacturing, and production perspective, it's moving inventory from one location to another, transporting raw materials, components, finished products, work in process inventory, all of those types of things around the different plants or different parts of the plant, raw material that's incoming, and things that have to get moved around to different parts of your assembly line, because you created all this excessive transportation or movement of things. So what we're looking to do is, when we map out our process, is we identify all these places where Dotwimpi is occurring. And again, we're going to just focus on the dot for today. We're going to focus on our next session on the Wimpy. But with the dot pieces, we look for any errors, defects, mistakes, any overproduction, any transportation that's taking place excessively in our processes. If we reduce those things, it automatically brings down our cycle time, brings down our costs, improves our quality, and reduces the opportunity for us to make mistakes, and makes for happier customers at a lower cost product, which then allows us to grow our market share and provide a better standard of living to our workers. So that, at a high level, is what Dotwimpi is all about. Again, this has been Frank Shines and Umar Qureshi with Analytics AI ML. Thank you.